Well, welcome everybody, and welcome back to Professor Juliane Hammer from the University of North Carolina, who many moons ago, although not as many moons, not that many moons.
Not that many.
Yeah, I mean some moons, a good number of moons, but not too many moons ago, was a fellow here at the center at Georgetown, so she knows the area and the lay of the land, and she knows some of our faculty. She is the Kenan Rafai Scholar of Islamic Studies at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and she specializes in the study of American Muslims, contemporary Muslim thought, women and gender in Islam, and Sufism. She's author of Palestinians Born in Exile, Diaspora, and the Search for a Homeland, which is 2005. I'm a fan of the book and of the impulse behind the book. And American Women, Religious Authority and Activism, More Than a Prayer, which is published in 2012. This is a book. It's about American women, religious activism, and religious authority, but it's centered around the idea of women-led prayer. Am I correct in saying this? That's what I recall.
Yes.
Okay. And she's the co-editor of A Jihad for Justice with Keisha Ali and Laura Silvers, which came out in 2012, and the Cambridge Companion to American Islam, edited with Omid Safi, which came out in 2013. Her next book, Peaceful Families, American Muslim Efforts Against Domestic Violence, is forthcoming. She's currently working on a research project on marriage and sexuality in American Muslim communities. So she's been kind enough to grace us with her presence, so the floor is yours.
Thank you. Yes, sure. Applause before I even start. What could be wrong with that? Okay, so I don't hear the microphone. Do you hear me
it's just
well?
recording. Just recording.
Oh, it's for
not
recording.
for
Okay.
amplification.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, I'm a loud person. This should be fine. So, and I'm going to get up in a second because I need my hands to talk properly. So I want to thank Professor Brown for inviting me to come up. I'm honored. And it is interesting to be back. So the years and years ago was about 15 years ago. And I was walking around campus and down M Street yesterday. And it's really interesting because it has changed, but it also really hasn't, which is fascinating to me. I think DC tends to change fast, but there are also things that have stayed the same. And then I started reflecting on the fact that 4 generations of undergrads have come and gone since I have been gone. And then I felt really old. But that's okay. So when I got the invitation, I immediately started thinking about what I would present here. As you have heard, there are quite a few things that I have been doing. And because the new book, Peaceful Families, is forthcoming, which means I'm done with it. I wrote it. I've been sort of in a state in the past few months of thinking about what I've been doing and what I want to do. I don't have to write any more books for, academic career purposes. I could just not write any more books. And so I decided to talk a little bit about things that come out of this reflection, that are a reflection on some of the work that I've been doing, some of the theoretical arguments that I've been putting forward. And in that reflection, I realized something that, I don't know, maybe was obvious to other people, but certainly not to me, which is that I've actually been studying activists and activism for most of my academic career. And I've also been a self-identified activist or scholar activist for most of my career. So I'm sharing with you a few of these reflections with examples from research that I've been doing over the past 10 years. I also realized that writing a paragraph about what your talk is going to be about is a tricky thing, because then you start making promises and then you have to see if you can deliver on them. I'll do the best I can. So I decided to tell you about 2 main arguments I want to make up front rather than developing them out of the materials and then telling you at the end. So I'll tell you in the beginning. But I want to start with an introductory point, which is to caution all of us, not only myself, but you as the audience as well, about approaching Muslim women. So the part of the title says Muslim women's activism, to approach Muslim women as a fixed identity category. So there are many, many, many Muslim women with many different approaches to activism. And there are also many ways in which they identify and sometimes don't even do that as Muslim. So for me, it's really important to not set this as a fixed category, in part because in its worst form, this insistence on a fixed identity category of Muslim women is a tool for anti-Muslim hostility, for practices and ideological discourses that can be turned against women. So I wanna make sure that these two examples that I will be talking about don't become representations of all that Muslim women do. They're not even a small part of that. And so we want to keep that open. The other brief point, and it's a little tongue-in-cheek, is that I will only talk about feminism twice. There is a lot of literature now on the relationship between Islam and feminism, and that's not to mention an ongoing, and I would say rather heated debate in Muslim circles about that relationship. If you're interested in that conversation or in sort of tracing it, one really good person to look for is someone named Fatima Sidat, who is a South African Muslim scholar of gender studies, who's written a couple of pieces that sort of trace these debates about the relationship between Islam and feminism. And just for the record, because I think in increasingly polarized debates about Islam and feminism, especially in Muslim communities and among Muslim scholars, feminism has become a red herring that makes it almost impossible to have a critical conversation. Having said that, I will also say that I identify as a Muslim feminist scholar, and what that means to me is that feminism as a method, I can explain that in the Q&A if you want me to, permeates my work. And so it's there. Okay. So now to the two main arguments I want to develop about Muslim women's activism. The first one is that I think activism is produced in the dynamic interchange between practice, experience, action, so practice / experience / action, and theory / discourse / thought. I'm not a great fan of binaries. I haven't figured out a way to get away from this particular one, but I would point out that the word production, so producing activism, already implies there is something practical, something that is being done involved there, and that there is no such thing as pure thought. So I think, and I will try and develop that a little bit with the examples, that practice and experience come before discourse rather than the other way around. And I draw here on feminist critiques of the privileging of thought over action. So I would argue with other feminist theorists that the privileging of thought is a tool for creating hierarchies, right? So like this binary, most of the binaries that we use in our thinking are hierarchically positioned. They're very, very rarely binaries that are sort of on the same plane and a matter of perspective only. And I do think that this particular one goes very well with other ones that we connect, that I connect, or that feminist critics connect to patriarchy. So the binary between the intellect and the body, rational versus emotional. And I would point out, because this is, I think, an important sort of point of comparison, that we often find parallel binaries, hierarchical binaries, in the production of Orientalism and in the production of racism. So there is a way in which I don't want to participate in the sort of emptying out of the idea of intersectionality, but I think the critique of that hierarchy and the exclusions that follow from it is actually intersectional in the original sense of the word. My second argument that I want to make here is that activism, Muslim women's activism, while born from experience and practice, or at the very least in a constant interchange between thought and practice, rather than one comes first and then the other one comes second, relies on specific ideas about change to justify its own necessity. That seems pretty self-evident. I don't know if it is. I have been thinking about it for too long to sort of figure out if everyone in the room is like, duh. But it goes further than juxtaposing the critique of existing practices and the need to change them with an unchanging notion of tradition. So one way to think about change is to say, okay, so we have an Islamic tradition. We know what it is. There's no debate about that. There is, we'll get to that. But what's wrong is the practices that we see in Muslim societies and communities. One version of this is Islam is great, but Muslims aren't. Very common, especially in activist sort of circles, as a way to think about this. And I would argue that activists, even when they don't explicitly frame their own work in this way, actually go further by laying claim to actively participating in creating a notion of what the Islamic tradition is, what this Islam is, or I am now a religious studies scholar, so what religion is more broadly. There are many more things to say about religion, how religion is produced as a category, but if we focus here on Islam, so to illustrate this a little bit, one of the things that I find increasingly and sometimes disturbingly in really theoretical scholarly work is sentences that go something like, according to Islam, or Islam says. That's probably my favorite. My colleague Aisha Chaudhry said many years ago, so Islam's not a person, in case you didn't realize that. You can't take her to lunch, so she can't say things. There's a version of that I think is interesting that actually goes back to Ali ibn Abi Talib, who is said to have claimed that the Qur'an doesn't speak. So there's sort of a parallel which has to do with the need to do something with a text. Even if we believe in the text, there's something we need to do with it. So what's at stake, in part, is a very active engagement with what this Islam actually is. And in the work that I think I'll be doing going forward, I'm going to think more about why it is that gender in particular is so central to that redefining and rethinking of the category of Islam. And within that project of participating in a production of the notion of an Islamic tradition, we also see that the Qur'an is perpetually central to that project. There is very little, not no work, but very little work that decenters the Qur'an from this work. And maybe together we can think a little bit about why that is. Okay, I'm gonna have to speed this up. So now to the two examples. I called the first one an ethic of non-abuse. That concept is central to the Peaceful Families book, in which I engaged in all 6 years of both ethnographic and sort of textual research on American Muslim efforts against domestic violence. So I was interested in organizations, individuals, and networks of people who do work in Muslim communities as Muslims. That was an important part of it. To do 1, 2, or 3 things. So there's overlap between these, but I always try to organize things even if they're not organized all by themselves. So the first one is to raise awareness of domestic violence in Muslim communities in a variety of ways. The second one is to provide services to victims of domestic violence, to survivors. And the third one is to educate, and I'm going to be cautious with this word, but mainstream domestic violence, the mainstream domestic violence movement, There are problems with describing it in this way. By that I mean not Muslim and not religious, perhaps, which includes mainstream service providers, law enforcement, lawyers, etc. About most of the time that education is about the needs, the specific needs of Muslim families and Muslim women in the context of American society and a state system that struggles with recognizing religion, religious needs, but also negotiates in really interesting ways the relationship between what is religion and what's culture. So that plays an important role in the book. When I asked in interviews about why advocates engage and service providers engage in this work, many, if not most of them, spoke about two kinds of experiences. And this is coming back to this question of experience. One was witnessing abuse in families and communities, and the other one was experiencing it in a variety of forms at one point in time. It is no big secret that both in the mainstream and in the Muslim anti-domestic violence movement, many of the people who work in that field are survivors or have some kind of experience with domestic violence. And their strong response to that was to say that they wanted to change something. So the reason why they're doing this work is because they want to change something about this. Now, I would argue that requires recognition of something being wrong. And I don't have enough time to go into the details of what it means to experience something and then verbalize it. But what I recognize there is what in the book I call an ethic of non-abuse, a baseline commitment to ending what they see as domestic abuse in Muslim families and communities. And again, there are lots of discussions to be had about how to define abuse, how to define family, what the causes of that abuse may be. But there is a commitment to that ethic of non-abuse. And that ethic of non-abuse is born from experience, not from the Qur'an, not from textual scholarship, not from the exegetical tradition. Rather, what happened with almost all the people I spoke to is that in a second step, after the experience and after the commitment to change something, they turn to Islam for support, to Islam, and I say that intentionally, to support this endeavor. They often do so by turning to the Qur'an. Really importantly, they turn to the Qur'an directly, not to scholarship on the Qur'an, so not to existing interpretations. That's most of the time a third step. And I would argue that that third step, to look for existing interpretations that support the ethic of non-abuse, comes out of recognizing authority structures in Muslim communities. So in other words, they're looking for support that will actually help them become authoritative figures in their own right in Muslim communities. So they work within the structures that they recognize in order to change them. That's an activist strategy, an established activist strategy. And in terms of the concepts that they work or operate with, the most common, and again, there's a lot of diversity here of sort of ways to think about that, but the most common was to identify domestic violence as zulm, as oppression, and then to develop a train of argument here from oppression, from zulm to injustice, and then to the need for injustice to be fought and to be changed. What's at the core of that, I think, is a much broader notion of a more just society and perhaps an ethical impulse for Muslims to be responsible for establishing a more just society in this world that we're in. One of the focal points in TV work is Qur'an 30:21 that talks about mawadda and rahma, so love and tranquility in the Muslim family, specifically Qur'an 4:34, which needs its own lecture, which I will not give today, needs to be wrestled with. For those of you who don't know what that verse says, it's very complicated. Can of worms is the term that comes to mind. Because the later part of that verse might emphasizing might authorize husbands to physically discipline their wives. I want to point you to the work of Aisha Chaudhry, who's explored various interpretations of 434 in different contexts and historical periods. But there's also a wrestling among advocates with Qiwama, with the first part of that verse that tells Muslims that men have, and again, depending on who you ask, a degree over women, have protectorship over women, have guardianship over women, have leadership over women. And in the book, I describe the framework that I saw most often as protective patriarchy, as using that verse in the Qur'an to say, yes, men have protectorship over women, and if they use it right, there is no domestic violence, because it is an abuse of the privilege of being a protector to, physically hurt someone's wife. So there's clearly an emphasis here on specific verses in the Quran. That's a particular exegetical strategy. And there is an investment in the authority of the Quran itself. So one of the things that I struggled with the most is, and I just pointed this out, there are many different ways to interpret these particular verses in the Quran and the Quran overall, and the Quran as an ethical framework. And in the work against domestic violence, the Quran has to be authoritative. And this possibility of multiple interpretations, what I think ends up in some cases as a form of exegetical relativism. So the Quran could say pretty much anything at all, as long as you find some way to make an argument about it speaking in that way. Then the Quran is actually less authoritative than if there is a particular interpretation that is right and all the other ones are wrong, right? So like if we have, for example, a domestic abuser who says, well, the Quran actually just gives me the right to hit my wife, then there's a sort of an impasse in which particular interpretations have to be invested as more authoritative, but that means the Quran is clearer perhaps than it appears in these interpretations. And then again, to sort of come back to where I started, I do think that all of these discursive formations originate in experience and then result in different strands of possible action. There's a wide variety of ways in which these are then reapplied or used in awareness work, for example. Okay. And again, I wrote like 250 pages about it. It's not fair to the project, but it's sort of a glimpse of some of it. And I'll be happy to explain things that you have questions about. My second example, I titled An Ethic of Justice. And I want to tell you a little bit about an organization called Musawah, which means equality in Arabic, that was founded in 2009 in Kuala Lumpur, but grows out of an older organization that dates back to the 1990s called Sisters in Islam, which was a mostly Malaysian organization of Muslim women, activists, journalists, and eventually also scholars who were trying to address issues of what they saw as gender injustice in Malaysia specifically. And so in the years leading up to 2009, Sisters in Islam gained sort of broader international traction and did outreach work, which resulted in the creation of a global network of activists, advocates, and grassroots organizations that were, and here again important, were already doing work towards justice as gender justice, but were brought together under the umbrella of Musawah to focus that work in specific ways. And so what most of Musawah's work now, I was thinking yesterday that it's been almost 9 years already, and a lot happened in those 9 years globally in the specific countries. But what Musawah has been doing over those years is two types of things. One is to create resources. Many of those are online. Many of those are available in different languages in order to make them accessible to people in different countries. So resources to argue for what they call justice in the family from within Islamic frameworks. So again, we have this, it comes from a place of experience, recognizing injustice, wanting to do something about it, and then recognizing that there needs to be a supportive discourse and a particular framework of Islam as essential, as an essential tool for establishing justice becomes the way to do that. And so they provide they've developed these resources. It's an ongoing project. Many of the resources are actually developed by people in different countries. And then what happens is some of them are sort of globally oriented and towards what Islam really says about X, and some of them address specific situations in specific countries and provide workshops, especially, so on-the-ground, in-person workshops for women, either women activists or women in communities, to provide them with tools to make better arguments and to empower them to go back to their communities and work for this change. I want to read you the opening statement of the Musawah Framework for Action, which it actually took them like 7 or 8 years to fully develop. It is, in some ways, it is one of the resources. It's available on their website, but it wasn't published in this form until last year. Based on a number of workshops, meetings with policymakers. And so this framework, the first paragraph reads, "This framework for action is a working document that provides a conceptual framework for Musawah, a global movement for equality and justice in the Muslim family. Musawah declares that equality in the family is necessary because many aspects of our current Muslim family laws and practices are unjust and do not respond to the lives and experiences of Muslim families and individuals. Musawah declares that equality in the family is possible through a holistic approach that brings together Islamic teachings, universal human rights principles, fundamental rights and constitutional guarantees, and the lived realities of women and men today." So 4 pillars, if you will. Musawah builds on decades of tireless effort by women's groups and activists in Muslim countries and communities to campaign for reform of Muslim family laws that discriminate against women and to resist regressive amendments demanded by conservative groups within society. There's a lot going on in that paragraph in terms of self-situating as an organization. So I want to repeat the sort of cornerstones. So Islamic teachings, universal human rights, fundamental nation-state-based rights, that's what that language is supposed to engage with, and lived realities. And so the lived realities piece initially was the most interesting for me, because to argue that something needs to be changed because it is clearly bad for women was, to me, at the time at least, novel. So Musawah produced in 2016 a book that's also an online document called Women's Stories, Women's Lives, in which they, based on several years of work in 9 different countries, collected women's life stories with regards to how they experienced Muslim family law and regulations that they saw as Islamic, and how that impacted their lives. It's a depressing document to read. And I was actually at the launch of that book, and it was both terrifying to think about how many of these life stories are really profoundly negative, but also very clear that that's precisely what informs and fuels the work, the grassroots work that's being done. So again, I would say Musawah's work grows out of grassroots efforts. So women activists witness and experience injustice. They recognize it as gender-based. I'll say something about feminism in 1 second again. And they respond to it through an ethic of justice, which includes gender justice. And there is an emphasis, even though it's the last of the 4 pillars, and it felt to me in conversations like the idea of lived realities as a source for discourse needed to be defended. And I think that that's in part because it's a really obvious reference to the feminist category of experience as a source for discourse. So this is an established conversation in feminist theory. And while this document, this 15-page document, doesn't mention the word feminist once, which I think is a strategic choice, many other materials are very open about self-identifying as feminist, and many of the grassroots activists and the people involved in Musawah do that all the time, and do it very confidently. So not in a sort of like we are feminists, but we're not going to tell anyone. That is, interestingly enough, very common in the anti-DV circles that I studied. So people are familiar with feminist ideas, but would never come out in public and say, I'm coming to this Muslim community with this feminist framework of gender justice and gender equality. It's implied, but it cannot come out because it decreases their authority in communal contexts. And I talked with some of them about that as a sort of strategic choice. So when I started doing work on Musawah and with Musawah, I was really impressed with the confidence. So I've been a Muslim feminist for many, many years and a feminist for even longer, but even I often feel the need to defend this feminism as something that's can never ever be taken for granted. The patriarchy is everywhere. Just saying. And more specifically, they draw, coming back to Musawah, they draw on both third wave feminism, which makes perfect sense for an organization that is situated in the third world, and also on other religious feminist work. So they're also very confident about the possibility of being religious feminists in a sort of, well, you might not like that, but we're doing it anyway kind of way, which is something I love about them. Qur'an 30:21 shows up in this document several times as well. So tranquility, love, and mercy between spouses specifically. But Musawah also defines or lays an overall claim very explicitly to the fact that they think Islam represents and strives for equality, fairness, and justice. These are the 3 terms that they focus on. And clearly the world as it is doesn't have those 3, and so work needs to be done to change that. More recently, they have focused... more recently, they have focused on 2 specific contexts. One, qiyama, which I already mentioned, which comes out of the Qur'an itself. And the second one is wilaya, which is a concept of legal guardianship that actually doesn't appear in the Qur'an as a legal concept quite in that way. And one of the things that they have produced is this wonderful book called Men in Charge, ? Big question mark, really big in red. Rethinking authority in Muslim legal tradition, that in which different scholars and advocates sort of develop these notions of what qiyama can be, should be, how wilaya could play out in practical terms in legal discourse and legal practices. And so if you're interested in this, the way in which they've developed this as what they see as an Islamic framework, but also, again, rethinking authority in Muslim legal tradition, I would have called it traditions, but of course that doesn't lay the same claim to the tradition, right? So there's an active way of claiming the tradition as theirs. So I see similarities and parallels with the domestic violence work. I think Musawah has a more confident claim to Islam, draws authority from the Qur'an as if there are no exegetical alternatives, even though, of course, they all know that they're there. But that turns experience into discourse, into action. And one main difference, as has I think already become clear, is their focus on law as the place where societies, Muslim societies in particular, can and should be changed. And in many cases, that is national legal systems. So lobbying with policymakers in countries that include Islamic law in the legal system. But it's also things like one of their most famous advocates ran for president in the Gambia. And eventually sort of gave up on that in order to support one opposition candidate. But she campaigned in the Gambia as a Muslim feminist lawyer and got quite a bit of attention, if not traction. Okay. So I want to finish talking and maybe show you a couple of minutes of the opening video that Musawah produced in 2009, because I think it's profound and maybe we could analyze it together, but I'll finish first and then I'll get up and do that. So these are closing thoughts, not conclusions. I'm always a little worried about closing doors after I've spent all this time opening up questions, and so I don't want to close anything. It's just sort of so that I get done talking. So Muslim women activists live and operate in a world that is full of injustices that do not only affect their ability to live their lives with dignity and agency. You would think that we could take those as ideas for granted, but we can't even do that. So agency over their lives, that is, but that often also threaten their bodily integrity and far too often their very survival. So I want to sort of get away from this academic talk mode where I get to make arguments and think about people's lives. The injustices that these women activists are trying to address literally kill people and hurt people and make it impossible for people to thrive. And I want to sort of reiterate that also because I care. So I just want to put that out there. And they're all heroes, every single one of them. I often feel sort of small in comparison. I think there is scholarly activism that is important, but they are the ones who are doing the most amazing work. They recognize the structures of the world around them and make clear, to me, clearly strategic choices to improve their ability to affect change in the direction that they aim for. So one of the things that I want to develop further is the idea that when we talk about change, we often assume that it can only go in one direction. There's this sort of linear history progressive narrative that I suspect is originally Christian, but that also permeates American discourse, that permeates capitalist discourse, and that we often sort of get sucked into as this obvious notion of where things are supposed to go. When you study activism, you realize that change does not go in one direction. And if I may for a second point to the current political situation in this country, I did not think 10 or 15 years ago, like when I was here, that things could be this bad. And I think that says something about sort of like the realities of where things can go and the assumptions we have about, you know, how, where change takes us necessarily. And so I would like to talk about this question of the relationship between experience, action, and discourse. I think ethics as a sort of key term is important. Ethics, I think, is both discourse and practice. And they do develop all of these in a very interesting, I don't know that it is a cycle, but an interesting kind of interdependent relationship, in part in order to gain authority in a patriarchal world that questions their very ability to make any arguments or do anything at all. And while their Islam, in quotation marks here, relies heavily on some kind of notion of stability that draws on both Muslim histories and a textual Muslim tradition, I would argue that they redefine the very notion of what that tradition is, and that part of that activism is to contest existing notions and change them. Okay, thank you.